So let me just dive straight in. What I'm going to do, as we go along, I'm going to introduce the guests in a way I see them. But to start with, I just want to thank Team PMS Bazaar for having organized this and for having given me the privilege. I'd also like to thank my colleagues Kashyap, Tejas, Nidhi for helping me come up with these amazing questions and on this inspiring topic. Talking about the topic, when you talk about $10 trillion economy for India, uh, guys, by the way, when these gentlemen talk, it's better you start taking notes. I'm going to take some notes as we go and speak. Ambition is the mother of growth. A lot of people credit the 1983 Cricket World Cup win in this country to change cricket from a game to cricket as a religion. In this country, but you don't realize that in this country, if it were not for the ambition displayed by the cricketing board, by the BCCI, you wouldn't have seen cricket being the powerhouse that it is today. And BCC being the entity it is today, it controls the world. But in 1983, it was just a speck on the horizon. It was that ambitious thinking which led to the growth of the BCCI. And now this undercurrent of ambition and growth is playing across various sporting disciplines. Now replace cricket with economy. And the same story seems to be playing out. By calling out for a $5 trillion economy by 2024, we've been inspired as its citizens and professionals to think outside our comfort zones and beyond our noses. One might argue that this is probably one of the reasons which you're seeing unleashing across the country in terms of the animal spirits which is starting to drive the economy in the capital markets. At this forum today, and I've been sitting down and seeing this, there's a clear energy, enthusiasm buzzing around. Today, a $5 trillion economy is talked about as a matter of time, not as a matter of discussion. And that is the change which has happened in our mindsets. What better forum than this today to spark off another ambition, another goal, mission $10 trillion economy. Today we have arguably the finest minds in the Indian capital market sitting on this dais, and of course, virtually. Between them, they have over 125 years of investment management experience, ladies and gentlemen. They have been and continue to be enormous wealth creators. But more importantly, as we all know, they have shaped the narrative of structured long-term thinking. It's my privilege to introduce the four panelists on the dais today. We all know about their professional achievements, but I'm going to try to very quickly attempt to bring out the person behind the professional, the individual behind the icon. So let me just start off by introducing these guys, and I want you to clap when I introduce them. Let's have some energy in the room. So I don't think any of you know what I'm going to talk about. So, Bharat bhai. Okay, I've been talking to the friends, colleagues, and this is what I have for you. Our first guest is a man who over the years, amongst his various achievements, has democratized and simplified stock market language or jargon for one and all. Substitute long-term compounding to create wealth to an easy to understand buy right, sit tight, and you get what I mean. He is often known as, I'm not finished, I'll tell you. He is often known as the saint of simplicity. Always curious, he often displays childlike inquisitiveness to understand complex business models and simplifying them to their bare building blocks. A very affable and approachable person, you would often hear endearing stories of him not remembering people's names. But ask him about a balance sheet and he will be able to tell you the profit after tax of a company like SAIL in 1999. He has that photographic memory. He has a treasure trove of stories to share. And his colleagues often try to spend as much time with him en route for meetings. They actually take longer routes for meetings so that they can just partake of his wisdom and insights. One of the finest ambassadors for Indian equities, a self-confessed admirer of Warren Buffett. Please put your hands together for Mr. Ramdev Agarwal, Chairman, Motilal Oswal Financial Services. Our next guest is a man who can be defined in one word, seeker, S-E-E-K-E-R. Always wanting to learn something new, he has been credited with identifying several trends way before time, primarily because of this innate inquisitiveness. His colleagues vouch for the palpable excitement he has even today when he talks to company managements, especially new age business ones. Very few people know that he is an avid sports person, plays extremely good table tennis, can skip a few hundred times without breaking a sweat, and is usually a wicketkeeper, the most difficult position in a cricket match. He's one of the most eloquent speakers in the industry and loves to learn new words all the time. Perhaps this comes out of a constant desire to self-improve every aspect of his life, where most of us are content to just improve a few. He admires Warren Buffett, and like him, most people expect our guest to be as sharp, witty, and loquacious well into his 90s. I've had the pleasure of working with and being influenced by this extremely humble person very early in my career. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Bharat Shah, Executive Director, ASK Group. Our next guest is a man who is a wildlife enthusiast and an avid marathoner. He has run the complete marathon quite a few times, and those who have run that, you know how difficult it is. Notably, the New York Marathon in 2018. He believes running enables him to focus better, pretty much complementing his love for yoga and meditation. And this is what I found fascinating. He comes from a family of committed equity investors. So much so that when a child is born in the family, a demat account is opened in the child's name and contributions are made in terms of equity shares. His mantra has always been that creating wealth is an equal partnership between the investor and the fund manager. There has to be an implicit trust for the process to work. Very low profile, easy to work with. His average employee turnover is over 10 years. He is our very own alchemist, creating gold for his investors' portfolios over the years. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a huge round of applause to Mr. Hiren Ved, co-founder, CEO and CIO of Alchemy Capital Management. Our next guest's first love in life was not equities. He actually wanted to play cricket for India. Or to put it the way he tells his colleagues, Captain India and beat Pakistan. Not surprisingly, he's a prolific batsman and a reliable all-rounder. Well, you know, Indian cricket's loss is definitely been Indian capital markets' gain. He got interested way back in 1985 when at a family gathering, he listened intently on his elders talk about things like IPOs, allotment, badla, and secondary markets. Coincidentally, that was the year the equity markets actually did spectacularly well and his love for equity blossomed. He's a very hands-on person, intensely focused on the relative outperformance and underperformance of his stocks to the benchmark almost on a real-time basis. That being said, his view on equities being the only asset class that can have long-term compounding gains over inflation over the long term is sacrosanct. He loves old Hindi movies and is a big fan of the movie Sholay. He enjoys discussing politics on one hand and plays competitive chess with equal ease. He has, ladies and gentlemen, over the last few years, made quite an impression in the Indian capital market space and is one of the forces to reckon with today. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Prashant Khemka, founder and managing director of White Oak Capital in today's discussion. This is a bit of crystal ball gazing. We're talking about a $10 trillion economy and probably some of the questions which might come in you would have thought of and we would want you to articulate as things go along. So this question is open to all panelists. I'll start with you, Ramdevji. It's a simple question to everybody. Let's assume that we are already a $5 trillion economy. Okay? Sometime in the near future. Now, if you look at the growth of economies from 5 trillion to 10 trillion, 2 out of the 3 have hit a wall when they reach the $5 trillion status. Now, Japan hasn't actually grown beyond 5 trillion for over a decade. US took 12 years or more to jump from the 5 trillion to $10 trillion mark. On the other hand, actually, China took lesser time to jump from 5 to 10 than it did from 2 to 5. Do you think that there is a template which one can follow looking at these economic growth of other countries, or there are certain competitive advantages available in India wherein we can have our own template for growth? I'll start with you, Ramdevji.
So, good evening, friends. See, this $5 trillion economic challenge, when you compare with the smaller countries, so there is always a cap on per capita income. You can go to about $50,000, $60,000 per capita. We are at $2,000. And that's why China is like a comparable country to India. They have 1.45 billion people. We also have 1.38 or 1.37. So, and our per capita income is $2,000. The global average is about $12,000 because the global GDP is about 90 trillion and number of people in the world is about 7 billion. So that makes it about $12,000, $13,000 average. We are at $2,000 and we are not a dead country in the sense that today Microsoft Google, now Twitter, IBM, all are run by Indians. So we are not the country of, they don't know anything types. So we deserve to be at least average. When you do average of about $10,000 today and 1.3 billion people, you're talking about $13 trillion. And the world is not static, let me tell you. World today is $90 trillion. They are growing at about 4 to 5% dollar every year. I'm not talking about real. Dollar growth is about 4 to 5 trillion. So in next 15 years, it will be a $180 trillion economy, world economy. In that, we have ample opportunity. And world wants more of digitization, more of IT, more of Indian exports. So there is a huge scope for India to. There is no guarantee that we don't have any rightful place to be there. We have to work for it. But the opportunity size is very large, and we to go from $2,000 to $10,000 when the world will go from 10,000 average to $20,000. That should be possible in the course of next 15 years. So we are at $3 trillion now. If we grow at about 10% dollar, that's where the rupee dollar parity will also come into picture. If you like first $1 trillion came in 2007. Now in 2021 we are at 3. Now you will go in 7 years at the rate of 10%. You'll go in 7 years to 6, and another 7 years to 12. So I think 2035, if we follow good economic policies, as you said, if the ambition of this government or any government in the power is to be $10 trillion by 2035, it is very doable. And 2040, even if they don't do anything, then also will be there. That's my sense.
Bharat bhai, do you think there are some competitive advantages which we can exploit en route to this $10 trillion economic status?
Yeah, I think many of those good points were articulated by Lawrence Summers 2 days back. And I think all the points that he made resonate with me. The first point that he made was about the entrepreneurial capability. Without entrepreneurial capability, you can never really grow at a faster pace. Ultimately, value creation, wealth creation needs power and energy of the entrepreneurial zeal. And America grew at a much better pace in last century when it was far more an entrepreneurial country. Over a period of time, it has become a place where most people want to work for somebody rather than want to set up a business of their own. And I think there is a telling difference between the two. Second, the digital capability, technology, understanding, adapting to it, and not just adapting to it, but really working further to create new solutions. So that should stand us in good stead as a country with huge capability in technology side. The two very major aspects that you can see, one, the startup ecosystem, the way in just 2 years' times it has exploded. It has implication on new business models. It has implication on research and innovation capability. It also has an implication for entrepreneurial energy being unleashed. Secondly, if you see the way so quickly in this pandemic time, how the businesses have adapted to become more efficient through digital. So all businesses eventually will be a smart combination of digital and physical. Nobody can remain completely physical as a maverick because that will hurt the interest. Nothing needs to be digital 100% because ultimately technology is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. And therefore, is more fungible confluence of the physical and digital will emerge. It has telling implication on capital efficiency, scale, delivery, customer satisfaction, and what have you. Apart from that, one of the key important inhibiting factor, which now seems to be in our favor, is a dramatic reduction in the cost of capital. And I think if new capital formation is not spurred merely by the reduced cost of capital, but it certainly is a very important enabler. And I think it has implication on capital formation, it has implication on value of the assets over a period of time, it has implications on the lending part of the businesses doing much better than what they have been in terms of the struggle, and India is underfunded. So there are plenty of other factors, but one last important factor, I think the will of the government to make a difference. I think that has been something which has been not in evidence in, so to say, concerted manner, but in last few years, I think the will of the government to make a difference to the citizenry, to their lives, and to ensure that the real material improvement in the lives of people happen, that India finds its own place under the destiny. That will is very important, and I think some of the key reforms which have been initiated in last 5-7 years, I think is a testimony. But one of the more important ones, very clearly, where government wants to be no longer a player, but an umpire, a referee, and the game is left to the private players to play the game well. I think government not being a competitor in the corporate capital is a very, very healthy and very opportune moment for leapfrogging this economy. So some of these, but there are many others.
I think Kiran, you're talking about three factors which Bharat mentioned. You talked about entrepreneurship, digital capabilities, decreasing cost of capital, and one, I think, which what Bharat Bhai and Ramdevji talked about, ambition of the government or the will of the government. What else do you think we should be throwing into the mix to talk about competitive advantages which India would have?
So I think all those points are, I think entrepreneurship is a very good point because when risk capital is available and you have entrepreneurship, it can do wonders like we've seen in the US. You mentioned about Japan and why they hit a wall, right? I think the Japanese are very hardworking. They were very diligent. They produce some world-class companies. But I think the difference is that it's a very closed culture. And I think where India stands on one of the softer aspects is that we have a very open culture. Indians go everywhere around the world and assimilate in every environment and succeed, right? And that is something which is very innate to Indians. Second, to take the point of digitization further, I think we were in many senses blessed to have been colonized by the UK. And I'm not saying this in any derogatory fashion because that introduced the language of English to India. And the language of the internet is English, right? If Indian software companies can digitize the Fortune 500 and the Fortune 1000, I'm sure that as we enter the internet world deeper and deeper, our strengths in understanding the digital language and our openness in terms of adapting to various cultures will make Indians successful. And see, some of the large companies globally, like Apple, Google, have grown not just because of the US market, because it's a 350 million market. And okay, it has $50,000 per capita, but they became big because they captured the world markets. And I think Indians can do that because just culturally, we have the ability to assimilate in any culture that we think of. So I think that's one softer aspect other than the other aspects, which the willingness of the government, the vision to get out of business and let private players do that, the capital that is today available, the platforms that we have created. In fact, the baby boom time of the US happened when US built highways, physical highways, right? That's what created a big manufacturing boom, a big travel boom. The auto industry boomed in the US. I think what is underappreciated is that India has created the digital highway. Okay. And that, I don't think any of us here dispute the fact that we will be a $10 trillion economy. But in my mind, the quality of growth from here on and the speed of growth will be far better than what we've seen in the past. The speed will be accelerated by availability of capital, entrepreneurship, and the digital economy. And the quality, because the kind of steps we have taken to create transparency in our economy with GST and everything going online, there's less and less discretionary powers given. So I think the quality and speed is what will differentiate us going from 5 to 10 trillion.
It's amazing. I think amongst all the points which you mentioned, I picked up open culture. This was something which I think it's very important. It's very core. And what better way than to ask Prashant, who's sitting out of Singapore today, looking at India from a global vantage point. Prashant, what is your view? What are your inputs in terms of the template for growth from 5 trillion to 10 trillion, and what could be our competitive advantages?
But I agree more or less with what Ramdevji, Bharatbhai, and Hiren has said. If we continue to grow at the pace that we are growing, 6 to 7% real terms, and let's assume that the inflation is eaten away by the rupee depreciation, then it will take around 20 years for us to get to the $10 trillion economy, 18, 20, something in that range. If we do well, as Ramdevji pointed out, it can be a dozen years or so, but that would entail growing at a 10% clip in dollar terms. Now we have to be careful in assuming that what took us from say $500 to $2,000, whether the same momentum can take us to $10,000. It's not a given, because if you see Latin America, a lot of the Latin American countries are stuck in that single digit per capita income level. And the problem, as far as I can understand, while multifaceted, the key problems is it's very difficult to do business in Latin America. And that has been the problem in India as well. It's very, very difficult. Obviously, we made huge strides from, in the World Bank rankings from 142nd to currently 60 or thereabouts. But being 60th best, while it's much better than being 143rd, but will any of us accept? We don't find it acceptable to be second best in cricket. Why should we tolerate being 60th in the world in terms of doing business? So we have to make it easier to do business in India, bring it down to top 5 places, top 10 places, simplify the regulations. There are still large number of laws and regulations which do nothing but create hurdles in doing business. For most part, they're well intentioned, but in practice, they don't serve the intended purpose. So that is something that I think if we remain at the 60th best place to do business, likely we'll end up taking more than 20 years to reach $10 trillion. But if we continue to make it, improve upon it from 60th, go to 40th, go to 20th, and so on, we can reach there in a dozen years. That's, if you ask me, the single biggest issue is the ease of doing business, because that leads to job creation, and job creation means more incomes. More incomes are tied to rising GDP.
So I think, Prashant, this is very interesting. I think you've probably touched upon a topic which is core to a lot of entrepreneurs in India, the ease of doing business. And I hope that as things are going along, there is a compounding of effort in terms of ease of doing business, and we start jumping the rankings far faster than what we have been doing so far. So Prashant, since I already have you in terms of audio from you, I'm going to ask you the next question immediately. On the face of it, when you're talking about moving from 5 to 10 trillion, there are several potentially lucrative themes available to capitalize on. If India were to eventually reach 10 trillion, what are the 3 themes, you could call sectors, you could call industries, that you are willing to back as a key driving force behind this goal, and why?
Certainly. So while it may not necessarily translate to, and because I must point out, I don't know where you got it from, but I don't look at real-time relative performance of individual stocks versus the benchmark. But I did enjoy that piece. I do talk about performance being all relative, but that's in a different context. But coming back to the point you raised, it just reminded me. What I was trying to say is, if I talk about the key themes or major sectors, it is not to suggest that investment opportunities would be predominantly from those sectors. Investment opportunities can be in come from various different sectors, and they do come from various different sectors all the time. But one clearly, as I think Bharat Bhai also mentioned, the digitalization. If you look at US, this at that time we used to just refer to all these as .com. Today nobody refers to these companies as .com, but they call them new age techs. But this entire new age tech ecosystem is bound to grow exponentially. And in US, it started in earnest, let's say in the late 90s. In China, it started maybe in the 2010 timeframe, about 10 to 12 years, a dozen years later after US. And in India, it has really picked up momentum. It started obviously several years ago, but it's picked up momentum and accelerated momentum over the last 2-3 years. And it can remain on that trajectory, and that would become just like US and China, where even in the marketplace, we talk about sectors available in the market. US, China, and other markets, the new age tech companies easily form 20 to 30% of the market. And very likely in India, from what currently is low single digit, we'll see the same on this segment of the market in the next decade or so, becoming 20-30% of the market. That's one. Financial services are already very well represented, and there would be these new age tech companies that also would be part of financial services. I see financial services remaining a growth driver for the overall economy, as well as particularly, private sector financials as they continue to gain share from public sector as well. There's a huge underpenetration in almost every segment of financial services. And third, healthcare services, again, very highly underpenetrated. And the digitization and new age tech would help accelerate that as well. So if I were to point out to your question, 3 specific areas, it would be the new age tech, financial, and healthcare.
Thank you so much. I think this is very interesting. Hiren, would you like to comment? By the way, I should also mention that this is purely for educative purposes. This is not a recommendation to invest. Please consult your financial advisor before investing. Okay. Now that we've got that out of the way, Hiren, what are the 3 themes, industries or sectors you would be willing to back for the $10 trillion economy?
Again, as Prashant mentioned, sometimes what's good for the economy may not necessarily be good for investors, right? It's great to build roads and bridges and airports, but probably with the exception of Larsen & Toubro, there's not too many engineering companies who've created consistent wealth, right? Because of the inefficiencies of converting opportunity into EBITDA and EBITDA into cash flow and cash flow into value, into market cap. But having said that, I think that if you look at the so-called Asian tigers or countries which went from being developing to developed, you will find that each of these countries had created a competitive advantage in some sector where those companies became global. For example, Japan did it in automotive and electronics. So you had the birth of Honda, Toyota, Panasonic, Sony. This same model was followed by Korea, and then Samsung and Hyundai and all of that happened. China did it in mass manufacturing. If you look at India, I think India's competitive edge, which is already proven today, despite all the constraints, is in IT services or technology, in pharmaceuticals, and in light engineering goods, auto components, right? I think that if I were to single out 2 areas where India have a proven competitive edge, where companies have reached some level of global scale, I think I would continue to bet on that, because you can prove that you can compete with any other company in the world when you sell to the international market. So I would say tech and technology services will continue to be a very, very strong sector, though we talk about 10 trillion more as an internal target of GDP, but exports also contributes to GDP. I think the other element when we move from a 5 trillion to 10 trillion is that our per capita will move from $2,000 to $10,000, which means that there will be more surplus left for discretionary consumption. So you move beyond roti, kapda, and basic housing to people want to, when they have more money, they will buy more discretionary stuff. Now it could be entertainment, it could be transportation, it could be holiday, it could be leisure. But the fact of the matter is that that's the big change that happens once you cross the $1,500, $2,000. So I think good, well-run businesses which focus on consumer discretionary items will do phenomenally well in India. And then I think everybody agrees that financial services has to be a bulwark. I think credit penetration in India is very, very low. In fact, we joke in our office that what is the definition of a developed economy? Now, people usually say in terms of per capita income. Okay, if you look at the chart of all the developed economies, they're all leveraged. 300 times leverage to GDP, right? So India is still developing. We're at 110% total debt to GDP. I don't say we need to go to 300, but I think the progression is very clear that because all these economies have borrowed from the future to consume and build today, and that's how they've become developed. I don't know the final answer, what happens when debt to GDP goes to 400 or 500%. God save us. But I think we are still at very early stages, and therefore good lending institutions, whether digital or otherwise, will also do well and participate. It's like an operating leverage on growth, right? So I think that's, those would be my bets. So, sectors which have a already proven globally competitive edge, consumer discretionary as incomes expand, and financial services.
Bharat, I'd like you to chip with your thoughts here. We're very keen to know that.
So, risk of making predictions is getting carried away and, getting swayed by the generality of the theme rather than the hard work of specific investment choosing, which is what investments is all about. And to that extent, I have a bit of ambivalent feeling about many of these kind of trend-setting ideas and long-range predictions. Secondly, while investing remains in future, because very little of the past or present is important as far as investing is concerned. Most of what is important and valuable about investing is about future. And therefore, there is no getting away about forecasting future, trying to bring that into the present, bet upon it, take a risk on that uncertainty, and win if your bets work out well. But, there is a danger of we over-believing our own forecast and getting carried away by those ideas and narratives. And ultimately, specificity and hard work of picking and choosing rather than getting carried away by the generality and the sweep of those tides is something that I'm worried about. Third, all that said, still it's, if I have to make some predictions, I would say without any question, financial services is a huge, huge opportunity to grow. Lending, asset management, financial services, all of those for a variety of reasons that have been mentioned. COVID has reminded us about our own fragility and the public health infrastructure. Therefore, pharmaceutical, healthcare, diagnostics, medical devices, what have you, all of that for a long period of time will have to be in a stage of reset for it to have an ascendance of an opportunity. I think insurance is falling in a similar territory. Whether you take life, whether you take health, whether you take other general insurances, there is a significant underinsured part of the economy. And even those who are insured are materially underinsured compared to what they should be. And therefore, I see that as a pretty secular long-term kind of a growth opportunity. Consumption of all kind, staples, durables, luxury, discretionary, chemicals basket, specialty chemicals, active pharmaceutical ingredients, active agrochem specialty, all of them remain valuable. Digital technology, software, again, are strength areas. I would say PLI scheme, the way it has been conceived, the way it has been pushed, it holds a great portent for renaissance of Indian manufacturing, hopefully. Early day to say and make a full prediction, but the initial signs are very, very encouraging. So some of these.
Excellent. Ramdevji, before I ask you for your top three sectors, the student in me is wanting to ask you a question, and I'm hearing all of you. Amongst the three sectors which you're going to talk about, is education and skill development something which you think will be very critical, or a thing which you would willing to back for the $10 trillion economy focus, or is it something which probably is there in the order of things, but it's not top three, it's 4, 5, 6?
Education sector? Yeah. See,
Education and skill development.
one of the, I mean, of course, Bharat Bhai, what he said about the perils of perfect prediction of future, I mean, and that's where the margin of safety concept comes. So clearly, I mean, it reminds all the growth predictors right now. But, one of the thing which is almost written on the wall is a digital, business designs. So what is going to happen is that, of course, you'll have your the excitement of the digital companies, which are going to be formed from the bottom ups, and you might be, paying some fancy prices for the hype. More than hyper growth, it is the hype which is there right now. So there could be some danger of that. But I remember Amazon came in '95. It got listed about $5-7, went to about $100, and in 2000 crashed to again $5. Not a single investor of 1996 are the investors today. So we can keep talking about $2 trillion stock, but the guys who bought with that hyped up stock price, none of them are the investors today. And I'm talking about the globally deep investing culture in US, and they didn't survive the crash. So there will be crashes in these companies, and hence we have to be very careful. Now coming to education and digital model, what is going to be biggest opportunity is the digital transformation of the existing businesses. And one of the businesses, say, if you take education as one of the businesses, it is most apt for not only transformation for the very high quality tutorials to reach our villages where there is no teacher also. It can be, Harvard education or best of the science subjects, best of the mathematics, best of the whatever subject you want to reach. Because in digital economy, why it is so? Because the marginal cost of the next copy of the software is zero, literally zero. And that allows me, and it reaches instantly, and it reaches all over the world instantly. And it's a friction free because internet is global. So this is the global distribution network of internet, which is just about 3-4 years old in India. I mean, meaningful 4G technology and spread is just about 4-5 years old. So you are going to see the education. I'm very clear that top quality educational instruments and literature is going to reach deep into the country, and it will have huge transformative, that reflexivity. If you give wonderful education to the kids in villages who are disadvantaged completely, they will come back in the same internet, with a lot of force. And so I know the hunger and the ambition and the drive and passion of those poor kids are no less than anybody in any part of the world. So yes, the education can be, the way software has been huge competitive advantage of India. In education, we can not only teach Indians, we can teach the whole world. In any case, most of the universities have Indian teachers. So why not teach from here, sit in Kerala and teach the world? So yes, it can be a very local, global, and very, very profitable business if the governments and regulators don't come on the way.
Thank you. That's very, very interesting. Bharat Bhai, I wanted to ask you this question. Yeah, I think all of us have talked about, all of us have heard all of you talk about the digital enablement, the aiding and abetting of growth for businesses through digital. So should one be betting for the future on manufacturers of goods and services, who are going to see immense growth, or should one invest in new stage distribution systems like e-commerce? I mean, quintessential, to paraphrase it, although I'm not doing it perfectly, old economy versus new economy.
First and foremost, it's not either or. It is both. The yin and yang of the life never changes. You need this, you need that as well. And to
Interesting.
try to swing too much that only this will prevail or that will dominate is letting swing our mind in a wild way. Therefore, ultimately, most of the things that you consume, apart from services, are physical things, and somebody does need to manufacture them and provide it to you. So we shouldn't really mistake this as new age and old age. Ultimately, value creation is a function of whether a business will grow, whether the profits will materially expand, whether the profits are real, and whether they are predictable and they are backed by sufficient quality so that the equation of conversion of the profit into value creation is a smooth and efficient one, and whether we have discipline to and capability to identify such packages, judge them in terms of their value, discipline to stick to a few ideas which have great chance of working rather than getting carried away by the generality and the sweep of it all, and wisdom to remain in the game long enough to benefit from it rather than have a premature ejaculation and hurt your own interests. So that remains, to my mind, really the drive. So whether plenty of so-called traditional, old age, or whatever description you give, markets don't know descriptions. Markets don't know names. Markets know eventually the quality and the mathematics of those names and its durability and predictability. If that is in place and those are credible ones, those are the ones which will create value. E-commerce, without any doubt, is we discussed, all of us right at the beginning, world is altered in a significant way. We started with the land, that is agriculture, some 400 years back as an agrarian revolution, but it had less scalability. With the labor aided by machines, the scalability improved. So that happened over different stages in 2 and 3 centuries back. We saw the last century mainly dominated by the power of capital, plenty of capital, and entrepreneurs who can take risk and convert all that into fantastic outcome. Now is the power of the digital technologies and digital enabling, where things can multiply at a tremendous pace, but equation, mathematics, and solidity of the investment idea doesn't change. Ultimately, in any investment equation, there is a left-hand side, which is the price that you pay or the market value of the firm. Right-hand side has to be nothing but the future cash flows, their durability, predictability over their economic life. Because they occur in future, you discount them back to the present using the time value of money. Sum total of it all must represent some meaningful superiority over the left-hand side equation, which is the price paid. So long as that equation, if there are losses today, then there must be profits tomorrow. There is no getting away from that. If there are less profits, then there have to be more profits and for a longer period, then only equation will make sense. And if profit paucity or inadequacy is extended for some length of time, then the economic life of the business has to be much, much longer and predictability has to be much higher for you to find the equation making sense. That equation, whether it is old age, new age, whatever e-commerce, doesn't change. We get carried away at times by themes and ideas, but ultimately economics is something that you can't get away from.
Very interesting. I'm reminded of Thomas Friedman in his latest book, Thank You for Being Late. He talks about the change and rate of change. Change has always been there around, but it is the rate of change actually which is starting to make a perceptible difference. And I guess what you're saying is don't get carried away by the semantics of the thing. They are interdependent on each other, the change and the rate of change, the manufacturers and the enablers. Thank you for that. Talking about, sorry, Bharat, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, no, I was just saying that ultimately in whole of the life is built around balance. Any extremity and there'll be centrifugal force which will throw it off balance. And therefore, whether in life, whether in business, whether in investing, that balance is important. And missing out on that and getting swung is a source of creating the seeds of destruction. And therefore, at moments of change or when moments of change are at a rapid level, that is where exactly the danger lies in mind getting carried away by irrationality rather than listening to the rationality and logic and wisdom of the long term.
Thank you. I'm just mindful of the time which all of you have here. So there is one question for each of you after I've spoken to Bharat Bhai, and there's a rapid fire question I'd love to, because I think the audience has talked about. Prashant, if you don't mind just waiting for a few more minutes, I think there's a question coming in for you also. Hiran, I'm just wanted to ask you this question. Bharat Bhai talked about manufacturing and yin and yang. I think the yin and yang in terms of manufacturing, the way it is panning out today, is the ESG considerations which are at play. You're talking about manufacturing being one of the key drivers for the growth of India towards a $10 trillion economy. Today, we have these ESG considerations being talked about. I think the earlier economies which grew did not have that. So, how much do you think it's going to be a sort of a drag on this whole process? You know, is ultimately the companies which are going to be propelling this, if they are going to be derated, the cost of capital going up, how much of a difference do you think it's going to be making towards this growth towards $10 trillion economy?
See, frankly, I think this ESG is just a new monkey on our back. And if you just break it up and go to the basic philosophy, what is it that ESG is trying to do? Respect for the environment, respect for society, and good governance. I think implicitly, whether ESG or no ESG, I think we all aspire that when we invest in businesses, there is good governance. Social good is something which is not today. The Tatas have been doing it for centuries. There are so many businessmen who are doing it. While at a very limited level, whether an entrepreneur is more socially oriented or not, may not have made a difference. But again, I mean, how do you measure some of these things is at least confounded me. Environmental, I think, is a given. I think any business has to respect the environment if it has to be sustainable. And I think sustainability is one of the important inputs when you look for investing, right? So I think this new ESG monkey on our backs should not bother us, right? And, whether it is clean and green, I think science will take care of it like it has for centuries, right? Science finds solutions for every problem. And I think that if there is a better way to manufacture something, science will figure it out. And if that is more sustainable and competitive, entrepreneurs will figure it out and adopt it, right? So I'm not too really concerned. Now, this whole short-term focus that whether mining companies will get capital because they are not ESG positive, I can't understand and comprehend, and frankly, I don't even have an answer to something like that. I think if it's if you require metal to make something, you will require it. And there are a clean way to do it. There is a efficient way to do it. You just do it. I mean, right? I mean, there is no other way to look at it. I mean, at best in the new world as it has happened, at least we've seen, I'm not an expert on that, is we had these trading in, green certificates or whatever you call it. And, somebody who generates a lot of that sells it to the guy who's deficit. I mean, that's not the way to heal the world, in my opinion. So, if Bharat Bhai has more wisdom than I have, so if he can pull this monkey off our backs, it's better.
That is an uncertain phenomena, more wisdom or not. But certainly the monkey that Hiren talked about, I think it's important to figure out, to just to add 2-3 more pranks to that monkey's behavior. Who seems to have released this monkey and who benefits by releasing such monkey? So maybe broking firms, maybe some ESG raters, maybe people who conceive such grand ideas and release around so that people fall in a straight line to it. Ultimately, no reasonable investor can ever say that they knowingly want to invest with crooked people or badly governed businesses. Social environment consciousness is an integral part of every meaningful business, every meaningful economic endeavor. Uh, Social part is little bit of a mixed bag. Ultimately, businesses are meant to create economic value, and social contribution has to be made from the personal wealth by people who create that wealth by running those activities and the businesses. So it's a bit of a gray area to my mind, but very straight-jacketed mechanical formula based on which to say that something is superior and something is inferior. I see large degree of vested interest, and I also suspect that there is very self-serving, homily serving kind of attitude in all this. If you look at last 2 centuries, who have been the greatest polluters of the world? It is America, Europe, and in last few decades, it is China. These are the people who have done infinite amount of damage to the world. Now, Europe, which is struggling to grow at little over 0% for a long period of time, in its own wisdom says that you have to, be conscious of this and conscious of that. You better pay for that if you have done that. Therefore, I suspect many of these are homilies, self-serving kind of ideas. We should pay sensible attention to the filters and ideas which have worked in investing for centuries. New monkeys and some more mischievous will keep getting released time to time.
I seem to have opened the Pandora's box for some monkey business here. But anyway, Ramdevji, a $10 trillion economy will mean a significant flow of income to a much larger portion of the population. Okay. Do you see a perceptible change in the asset allocation of households from what it is today to what it will be at a $10 trillion economy level?
Clearly, there will be. One is, of course, what we are, whether it will happen or not, it is happening in last 12 months. One of the things which most of the people, at least media has not given enough exposure is the participation in the marketplace. And in 2000, in 60 years, or maybe we have 800 million bank accounts, and we had just about 40 million demat accounts. That was March 2020. In October 2021, exactly 19 months this thing henceforth, we have 74 million demat accounts. And now, first 7 months, it was 1 million accounts. Then 2 million accounts for 5 months. Then for another 5 months, it was 3 million. October was 4 million new accounts. And November probably would be 4 again. So we are running, if you multiply 4 with 12, it's about 48 to 50 million new accounts into the country. And it may be very small accounts, 5, 10,000, 20,000. But that clearly changes the structure of the market. And that's why when the FIs are selling, this retail is silently absorbing. And capital allocation is clearly changing. And with them, even the HNIs and the corporates, they are changing their allocation from, say, 50% fixed income or 60% fixed income to more like another 10-15% into the equities. So that because another thing which has happened, 2 things which have happened. One, digital onboarding. For 35 years, we had physical verification of the KYC. The guy is coming to invest. He's not coming to borrow. You're stopping him from investing. And now there is a digital onboarding thanks to COVID. And that has changed everything. There's 4 million accounts you cannot imagine 4 million accounts in a month. We used to get 100,000 accounts 3 years back annually, and it used to be a lot of effort. Today we're getting 100,000 accounts every month. So that's a scale change which is happening. And my sense is we are going to be 150 million accounts by the time it's next Diwali. So that's the kind of expansion we are talking about. Clearly, at a national level, capital allocation is changing. At individual level, thanks to the low, fixed income yield, net of taxes, it is not more than 5%. So that is also driving the capital allocation. And third, of course, the performance of the equity markets and the economy. Now economy will perform because your secondary market is working. You see the startup investing, PE investing, there is a massive momentum. And now for the first time, serious amount of money is going into the economy. Now economy is driven because of the money which is going to come in. So it is going to become virtuous cycle. And as a more and more participation is coming, I would think that of your say 20-22% household savings, what used to be a percentage barely coming into the market, it could be 4-5%. And if interest rate remains at about 4-5%, God knows what will be the allocation. So clearly there will be change. The change is visible and it will become even accelerated as the sustained performance is there. And the risk to this entire trend could be the regulation. Yes, because if market, because when the hype becomes kind of a boom, at some point of time it will go out of hand. Then the RBI, SEBI, government, they should not panic. And now the capital markets will become mainstream in India. First time, like in US, the Treasury Secretary is mindful of markets. The market should not collapse. It should not be disturbed. India has been kind of aloof to the political dispensations, have been very aloof to the market conditions. Now, as the households, I mean, like if 150, 200 million households participate in the market, governments will have to take care of this particular district.
So Ramdevji, let me start off with you. It's a rapid fire question. There is usually a choice I'm giving you, but if you don't agree with that choice, then your third answer very cryptically. Calendar year 2022, this is all about calendar year 2022. This is purely for educational purposes. Please consult your financial advisor, etc., etc., etc. CY 2022, value or growth? Always growth. See, that's brilliant. CY 2022, Nifty, December 2022, what level?
About this is 70,000, isn't it? Right now? So maybe 17 to 18.
17 to 18.
Yes.
Okay. Hiren, 2022, large cap, mid cap, or small cap? The year of large cap, mid cap, or small cap?
Difficult one.
Just give me whatever you think. I mean, like I said, this is just for fun.
Large cap.
Large cap, wonderful. 2022, established war horses or startups?
Internet businesses.
Okay, that's as cryptic as it gets. I take your point. Okay, Prashant, this is just one word here or there. One asset class beside equity. And I know there's a large audience who's really waiting for you to say crypto, but you can you can skip that. One asset class beside equity, 2022. What is it going to be the year of besides equity?
I don't know really.
One asset class beyond equity: real estate, bonds, gold, crypto, whatever.
Real estate.
That reminded me of that Sholay ka scene. Anyway, year of active managers or passive funds, 2022.
Active.
Active. So okay, I'm glad you didn't flip the coin for that. Ramdevji, FII preference, emerging markets or developed markets?
Emerging markets.
Calendar year 2022, year of PSUs, yes or no?
It could be.
Could be yes or no.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So there were 8 questions. You got cryptic answers to all of that. Thank you so much
Thank you.
to all of you. Really enjoyed bringing this session to you. Thank you, Team PMS. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being such a wonderful audience. Maybe I have a big round of applause for all the guests.